So that's my little brief history lesson. There's plenty more to learn and to know about the history of planning. It is quite fascinating if you're interested. There's all kinds of resources and ways to go and look and think about the way that our cities are built. But now I'm going to turn the page a little bit and move into the 20th century and talk about federal policy and local land use. And we like to think that everything's a free market, right? This is America. We don't cotton to regulation. So we see things like this and we think they're products of the free market. A pod of commercial over here and a pod of multifamily separated from a pod of single family residential with highways connecting everything in a move cars as fast as possible manner. This entire environment has nothing to do with the free market. It is entirely built on decades and decades and decades of federal, state, and local policy. It is the product of a world that we designed. It is not a product of the free market. It's about the furthest you can get from the free market as anything else in America, save maybe utility, which is a regulated monopoly. So this is a short list of policies at the federal level that really influenced local regulation, going all the way back to the 1920s when the federal government established some model legislation for states to enact in order to delegate the police power of land use regulation down to the municipalities, be it a county or a parish or a township or a city or town. Then in the 30s, this sort of accelerated with the New Deal era programs. You get public housing, you get the Federal Housing Administration promulgating some rules about how to borrow, for lenders on how to lend money to home borrowers. Moving into the 1940s and the post-war era, you get the federal government getting more directly involved in the American dream of owning the single-family home in the burbs with the VA loan program and the Housing Act, which provided loans to municipalities to clear slums. And then in the 1950s, the Urban Renewal Act and mortgages backed by the Federal Housing Administration. The modern 30-year fixed mortgage is entirely a product of federal policy. It is not an innovation of the banking industry. It was mandated by the federal government. Prior to the 1930s, when they first started getting into these regulations, banks would typically lend you money to buy a house for 10 years. And typically with terms like, you put 50% down. Can you imagine trying to put 50% down on a house today and only having 10 years to pay it off and a balloon payment at the end of that 10 years? It's just a completely different world than we live in now. So on the transportation planning side, there's a tremendous amount of federal money involved in that program, and there's rules that say there's a lot of local control. However, that control can be illusory because of the level of regulation and policies in place. It's difficult. The federal involvement in the transportation planning process really goes back to 1916, so it predates their interest in land use planning. But of course, we know that transportation or access to land drives the desirability of that land. So any transportation plan is a land use plan, and the best transportation plan is a good land use plan. So they're inexorably linked together. So going all the way back to 1916, there was 50-50 match program for federal aid highways. In the 1920s with the Phelps Act, they established those routes. So they mandated to the states, hey, we want these federal aid highways to connect point A and point B. and they drew maps to specify those. The map that I show is an outline of the Dixie Highway from Michigan to Florida. This is why development was driven the way that it was in the beginning of the 20th century, the Florida land boom. If you look at the cities that they're connecting, all of those cities are highly influenced by the land boom in the 1920s, and that's because roadways connected them. Our own Tamiami Trail is a product of local boisterism first, but the real money to finish the project was provided by the federal government. So the federal aid highway system grew into the interstate highway system in the 1950s with the federal acts in 54 to provide more funding, and in 56 to actually designate the national highway, the interstate system and the defense highways. And this is where the federal money, the tap really opened, because the program went from being 50-50 to being 90-10. So $9 for every one local dollar. It's a good deal for local governments or state governments. And it created the National Highway Trust Fund and established a federal gas tax to provide a fund for that money. Federal Aid Highway Acts, they've changed over the years. In '62, they had a mandate for local planning, and you have the creation of the Metropolitan Planning Organization. If you're going into engineering, into the private sector, working for any of the engineering firms around the state, and you have any interest in transportation, most of the money for most of the major capital projects is coming through, filtering through these MPO processes. So if you look at an MPO, they have a long-range transportation plan and a 5-year capital improvements plan called the Transportation Improvement Program. That's where your projects are. That's where your future business is in those plans. There are 26, I believe, 27 MPOs covering the state of Florida, as you can see on this map. They're mainly geared county by county. There is a Heartland Transportation Planning Organization, TPO, in the center of the state here, and they cover multiple counties, which is one of the few exceptions to that county by county rule in the state of Florida. MPOs have four core functions of setting fair and partial playing field, evaluating alternatives, providing a regional transportation plan, the Transportation Improvement Program, and providing a venue for public involvement. As I said, MPOs are highly regulated, so the level of local control in this is really steered by the state government, because they're the ones who ultimately control the money that's in the Transportation Improvement Program. So even though the local MPO may set the priorities, the state still gets to say which ones they fund. Currently, and this is the last year of it, we're under the FAST Act, which was adopted in 2015. And the expenditures laid out in this are $52 to $56 billion a year. Currently, the gas tax revenues, and this is 2018-19, not under the current situation, but in those previous years, we were collecting around $41 billion a year in gas tax revenues. And that disconnect, that $11 to $15 billion a year, those are all transfers from the general fund into the highway transportation fund. So anybody who tells you that roads pay for themselves in terms of gas taxes, they're a liar. And excuse my curse word, they're a damn liar, because it's just not the case. And it hasn't been the case really ever. But particularly now in the 21st century, the federal and state governments and local governments, where they're allowed, have been reticent to raise gas taxes. And because of that, the revenues have fallen far short of the actual needs for the transportation system. Just a quick local anecdote, here in the city of Punta Gorda since 2010, 11, we've subsidized our annual roadway resurfacing program with $460,000 from the general fund. That means that ad valorem, or property taxes, for our municipality are funding the lion's share of roadway resurfacing. Our gas tax allocation really goes towards keeping the lights on. Literally keeping the street lights on, keeping the signals running, keeping the right-of-ways mowed and free from vegetation, keeping the drainage systems clear. The actual capital maintenance of roadway resurfacing is paid for by property taxes. And this is true not just of our municipality. We're not being physically irresponsible. We're actually being very physically responsible because we're maintaining our system quite well. But this is a nationwide problem at the local level. The municipalities, states, and the federal government having